This is the downfall of England's most hated king, and it's deeply satisfying. Before he was King John, he was John Lackland, a nickname that cut deeper than any sword. As the youngest son of Henry II, John was never meant to inherit much of anything, certainly not a crown. His elder brothers, especially Richard the Lionheart, were born warriors destined for glory. John, by contrast, was viewed as a schemer, a political snake, slithering in the shadows of greater men. But ambition doesn't care about birth order. When Richard took the throne in 1189, John's jealousy festered. With Richard away on crusade, John plotted against his own brother, trying to seize power in his absence. His betrayal was blatant, his loyalty paper-thin. When Richard was captured and held for ransom, John even attempted to usurp the throne outright. Though his coup failed, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Even after Richard's eventual death, few believed John had earned the crown, but he claimed it nonetheless. From the start, his reign was plagued with disaster. Within 5 years of taking power, John had managed to lose Normandy, a crown jewel of the Angevin Empire, along with nearly all of England's French territories. A series of military blunders, cowardly retreats, and diplomatic failures turned John into a national embarrassment. The once vast Angevin Empire crumbled under his rule, piece by humiliating piece. The English barons, already wary of John's legitimacy, now viewed him with open contempt. His failures on the battlefield were compounded by his arrogance at home. He blamed everyone but himself. Traitorous barons, incompetent generals, even divine misfortune. But in reality, it was his own ineptitude that had driven England into disgrace. By the early 1200s, King John had transformed himself into a tyrant no one respected. To fund his endless failing campaigns, he squeezed his subjects dry. Taxes skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. Nobles were extorted under threat of imprisonment. Towns were fined for imagined slights, and even the church found itself in John's crosshairs. His cruelty was not reserved for the powerful. Legends tell of John imprisoning dissenters in dungeons without trial, starving political rivals to death, including his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, whose mysterious demise, many suspected, was orchestrated by the king himself. Whether these stories were truth or rumor hardly mattered. The people believed them, and their hatred for John festered. The final straw came from Rome. In 1209, after a bitter dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope Innocent III excommunicated John. This was no mere spiritual rebuke. To be cast out by the church was to be branded an outcast, a king with no divine legitimacy. His subjects whispered of curses, his barons whispered of rebellion. Even his allies began to distance themselves. Yet John remained defiant, lashing out with more taxation, more oppression, more cruelty. His iron grip was cracking, but he was too blind to see it. By 1215, the storm broke. The English barons, pushed beyond their limit, rose in open rebellion. This wasn't a factional squabble or a mere protest. This was a full-scale uprising against the king himself. Under the banners of justice and ancient rights, they confronted John at a meadow called Runnymede. Cornered, outnumbered, and facing the collapse of his reign, John had no choice but to kneel. The result was the Magna Carta, an unprecedented charter that limited the king's power and enshrined rights for the nobility, the church, and, indirectly, the common people. Though written in the dry language of feudal law, its significance was explosive. Imagine the scene: John, face twisted in contempt, affixing his royal seal to a document that declared he was no longer above the law. The self-proclaimed ruler by divine right, reduced to a mere man bound by paper and ink. The very barons he had extorted now forced him to sign away his unchecked authority. It was a moment of profound irony. The king who had ruled with cruelty was now shackled by the very people he sought to dominate. But true to his nature, John never intended to honor the Magna Carta. Almost as soon as the ink dried, he sought ways to undermine it. He appealed to Pope Innocent III, who obligingly annulled the charter, declaring it void. John took this as a green light to retaliate, plunging England into the chaos of civil war, the First Barons' War. Yet, despite his defiance, John was a man unraveling. The war sapped his resources, his allies abandoned him, and his enemies grew bolder. His attempts to reclaim control were marked by desperation, not strategy. Each failure compounded his isolation. As the war dragged on, John became increasingly paranoid, fleeing from stronghold to stronghold, never lingering long enough to feel safe. His health deteriorated. The once ambitious prince was now a sick, embattled king, despised by his people and hunted by his own nobles. In October 1216, fate delivered its final blow. While retreating across the treacherous marshlands of East Anglia, John contracted dysentery, a wretched, humiliating disease. As his body weakened, his few remaining followers watched in grim silence. There were no prayers for his recovery, no loyalists rallying to his side. England was already looking beyond him. John died in agony, abandoned and reviled. His death was not marked by mourning or grand tributes, but by a collective sigh of relief. The tyrant was gone. But his legacy would endure, not through monuments or songs of glory, but through a tattered parchment signed at Runnymede. The Magna Carta, born of rebellion against his tyranny, would outlive John by centuries, shaping the foundation of constitutional governance, inspiring future generations to hold power accountable. King John's reign was a masterclass in how not to rule. His cowardice, cruelty, and incompetence ensured his downfall. And history has not been kind. He ruled with fear. He died in disgrace. And history remembers him as nothing but a warning. John's death was not the end of his humiliation, only the final nail in a coffin of disgrace. England, battered by civil war and abandoned territories, was left in chaos. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, would inherit not an empire, but a broken crown. The once mighty Angevin dynasty lay in ruins, thanks to one man's staggering incompetence. In life, King John had clawed for power with ruthlessness and greed, but death robbed him of even the dignity of legacy. His name became synonymous with failure. His own contemporaries called him John's soft sword, mocking both his military ineptitude and his weak will. Chroniclers of the time didn't mince words. Roger of Wendover, a monk and historian, wrote that John was a tyrant, foul with lust and a disgrace to the crown. Medieval biographers painted him not as a tragic figure, but as a warning, an example of unchecked power turned to rot. For a king obsessed with control, his downfall was poetic justice. The very barons he had tried to crush had forced him to kneel. The church he had insulted excommunicated him, severing his claim to divine right. The people he had taxed and terrorized turned their backs, eager to see another wear the crown. In the end, he died alone, powerless and reviled. Yet paradoxically, John's reign birthed one of the most important documents in political history. The Magna Carta was not a symbol of his strength, but of his submission. Though initially conceived as a peace treaty to placate rebellious barons, its broader implications were revolutionary. For the first time, it established the principle that the king was not above the law. Clauses limiting royal authority over taxation, justice, and feudal rights planted the seeds of constitutional monarchy. In the centuries to come, these ideas would echo far beyond England, influencing democratic governance across the Western world. Ironically, John's greatest contribution to history was his own defeat. As the First Barons' War raged on, foreign powers circled like vultures. The French, eager to capitalize on England's instability, sent Prince Louis to invade. Several English barons even invited him, preferring a French ruler over their own king's disastrous bloodline. That's how deep John's failures ran. His own nobles preferred a foreign prince to continue the fight against him. It was only through the loyalty of a few, like William Marshall, and sheer happenstance that the Plantagenet line survived. But John would not live to see the fragile recovery. His war had left the kingdom fractured, his treasury drained, his credibility obliterated. While his predecessors had been remembered as conquerors, lawgivers, or at least as tragic figures of ambition, John was remembered simply as the worst. A monarch whose greed, cowardice, and vindictiveness brought a nation to its knees. Even centuries later, historians remain united in their verdict. Victorian scholar Kate Norgate dubbed him the worst English sovereign who ever lived. Modern historians, from Dan Jones to Mark Morris, echo the same sentiment. Unlike his brother Richard the Lionheart, whose flaws were at least counterbalanced by military brilliance and personal charisma, John had no such redeeming qualities. He was not a misunderstood genius or a victim of circumstance. He was, quite simply, unfit to rule. His personality defects, paranoia, pettiness, cruelty, were amplified by his complete lack of leadership skills. He alienated his allies, underestimated his enemies, and treated his own subjects as disposable assets. Every opportunity for redemption was squandered through his arrogance and incompetence. The stories of his reign read less like royal chronicles and more like a darkly comedic tragedy. A king who lost more land than he gained. A ruler excommunicated by the Pope and despised by his own nobles. A man whose most lasting legacy was a document that exists solely because of his failure. And even his death was stripped of the grandeur expected of kings. Dysentery, a disease of filth and poor hygiene, was a fitting end for a monarch so consumed by his own excesses and neglect. No grand battlefield glory, no martyrdom. Just a slow, painful demise as his body betrayed him in the same way he had betrayed his people. Today, King John's name lingers in history books, but not in reverence. He is the cautionary tale whispered to students of power and leadership. The king who had everything to lose and lost it all through his own folly. Yet perhaps that's why his downfall is so satisfying. History is filled with tyrants and despots, but few see their comeuppance so directly tied to their personal failings. John was not overthrown by foreign invaders or tragic misfortune. He was brought down by his own greed, his own arrogance, his own cruelty, the Barons' rebellion, the Magna Carta, even his lonely death, each was a consequence of his actions. In the end, his enemies didn't need to destroy him. He did it himself. When we look back at King John's reign, it's tempting to feel a grim satisfaction. Justice in its purest form is rare in history, but John's story delivers it in full. He rose by betrayal, he ruled by fear, he died in disgrace, and history remembers him as nothing but a warning. The Magna Carta lives on, enshrined as a cornerstone of liberty and legal limits on power. King John's tomb, however, rests in quiet ignominy at Worcester Cathedral, a monument not to glory, but to failure. For the man who once dreamed of empires, his legacy is a crumbling ruin. His story, a timeless lesson in how power without respect, without competence, and without honor inevitably collapses. He thought himself untouchable, but history reached out and dragged him down. And if you thought this king had it bad, wait until you see how an executioner lived.